Namo Amida Butsu, Namo
No.
Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. I had been working on my Dharma message for the last 2 or 3 weeks. I had it all prepared. And because today is International Left-Handers Day, and because I'm left-handed, my talk was a lighthearted one about being left-handed in a right-handed world, which led me to think about being Jodo Shinshu Buddhist in a country that's predominantly God-centered here. And that was the focus of my talk. But watching the news this week about the wildfires on Maui, and then on Friday, I opened up Facebook and saw Cheryl's post about the devastation of the 3 Buddhist temples on that island, followed by an email from Reverend Ron with an attachment from the Hongwanji mission in Hawaii, which discussed the loss of the Lahaina temple and the loss of members' homes and of members' livelihoods. After learning about the increasing death toll, all of that just made me think, how can I talk about celebrating Left-Handers Day as if I'm oblivious to the recent devastation and sorrow that is going on right now? So I decided to switch gears. And since I decided to do that Friday morning, I had very little time. So please forgive me. My writing process usually goes over, well, for those of you who write, maybe you can relate. First, I spent a few weeks anguishing over it, and then a period of weeks in which I write, let it sit, revisit, and revise. But I've had no time for that in this talk. As we all know, things change, often in a moment, and we need to make the shift. So that's what I did on Friday morning. Today is just some of my thoughts on being human, on loss, and on suffering. And sadly, it seems that has been the subject of several of my Dharma messages, suffering and loss. And I know that suffering and that loss is not unique to our time, even though it feels as if so much is imploding and exploding right now. But even with that knowing, it is painful and difficult and frightening. Seeing the devastation on Maui is so sad and upsetting. I usually watch PBS News every night, and lately it seems that it starts off with a story connected to weather, extreme heat, wildfires, flooding, drought. And when it's yellow and hazy outside in the middle of the day here, due to the Canadian wildfires, as I sit outside on my porch reading and drinking my tea, reading the newspaper, it just feels incredibly surreal, as if I'm in a movie where it begins with the news talking about whatever disasters occurring, and then the scene cuts to scenes of people just going about their day as if nothing is happening. It sometimes seems to me that that's us right now. And it feels as if the world is falling apart, and it can be overwhelming, and that all we can do is go on with our daily routines, despite this little knowing inside of us, deep down inside, that things are not okay. So I spoke in a previous talk about the harsh reality during the time of Shinran Shonen. They had climate conditions that caused drought and untimely deaths and political upheaval and hatred and cruelty. And I'm not resharing this in order to say that's just how things have always been, and so we should just shrug our shoulders and move on. Because yes, all that's happening now is heartbreaking, it's overwhelming, it's upsetting, it's painful. I'm reminding us of those times because it's in recognizing that Shinran Shonen lived during such difficulties. And by the way, the historical Buddha lived during challenging times as well, that we can understand our own humanness our own difficulties, our own very human responses and fears and worries. And in that understanding, that we may find comfort and hope in their teachings. Shin Buddhist and poet Isaac Kobayashi, as many of you know, is one of my favorites. He wrote, "This world is like a rope plaited with strands of joy and anger, pain and pleasure. All that meets will part." So yes, the world is constantly shifting and changing. Joy comes and goes. Pain intertwines with pleasure. It lets up, and then it returns. My day yesterday was all about that. I went to a funeral at 12 noon, and at 5 p.m., I attended my granddaughter's birthday party. So I'm a little bleary-eyed today because I was crying and then laughing yesterday. And just a few weeks ago, we were celebrating Obon, dancing and laughing. And today we're grieving about the losses felt by our fellow Shin Buddhists on Maui. All that meets will part. When we celebrated Obon, Reverend Ron talked about our ancestors being so close. I just love how he says that they were sitting on our front porch because they are with us. Their love and their suffering and their histories live in us. And our quote today from Thich Nhat Hanh echoes that understanding. If you look deeply into the palm of your hand, you will see your parents and all generations of your ancestors. All of them are alive in this moment. Each is present in your body, and you are the continuation of these people. And so I think about the difficult life of my ancestors, of my maternal grandmother who had 14 children, and they were extremely poor. The children, including my mother, literally did walk to school barefoot. And their house burned down. My mother told me about the deep scars on her mother's back from the fire because she frantically ran back and forth into the house to save all of their children. And when my mother and my aunts and uncles would reminisce about her, they spoke in reverent tones about how she brought such beauty and love into this world. And that's what they carried on from their mother. And my own mother raised 4 of us on her own with very little. I previously shared a story about how we would have pancakes for dinner sometimes because we had nothing else to eat in the house. And she would make them into fun shapes, and we all thought it was the most wonderful treat. And my memories of her and of our impoverished childhood and of those pancakes are nothing but sweet, because she was soft and she was sweet and kind and loving. And if I could be a 10th of what she was, I would be grateful. And I think of the Japanese Shin Buddhists who lived here in earlier times, the ancestors of some of you in our Sangha. They suffered and life was hard. The first 2 Shin ministers traveled from Japan to San Francisco in 1899 with the mission to bring the Dharma to the Japanese immigrants who had settled there. They wanted to support them in maintaining their Japanese culture and to help the people preserve Jodo Shinshu Buddhism in a place that was primarily Christian, in a place in which the inhabitants often felt pressured to be Christian. There was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle that covered those priests' arrival by sending out the alarm. It stated that their intention was to convert white Americans to the belief that Buddhism was superior to Christianity, which just demonstrates the prejudice and the misunderstanding that was prevalent. And then during World War II, even though Japanese communities had been here for generations, they were uprooted and they were forced into internment camps. Approximately 125,000 people went through this. And during that period, the Japanese Buddhist ministers were specifically targeted as incompatible with the American way of life. They were determined to be un-American and anti-Christian. And for those in the military, the Japanese Americans who served in the war, they requested Buddhist chaplains, but they were denied because Buddhism was not believed to be an official religion. Only Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish chaplains were designated. And yet, despite all of this, Shin Buddhism is alive and well today here in the US. The ancestors are alive in this moment, and their strength and their fortitude and commitment remains. And so man's inhumanity to man and natural disasters and man-made disasters, loss, suffering, sorrow. The historical Buddha saw it all. He understood all of this, that we really cannot control anything, and we suffer if we try. He contemplated the cycle of life and death, and he realized nothing is ever permanent. He recognized how hard it is for us humans to accept any of this, even if we understand it intellectually, especially in the face of huge sorrows. So I don't really know how we hold all the suffering and loss. I don't know how to fix it. But I do know that it is through Shinran Shonin's teachings that we can pull all that the historical Buddha taught, and we gather it together into a way of living. I do know that it is through Shinran Shonin's teachings that we find refuge and peace for ourselves. Because he also understood man's inhumanity to man. He experienced suffering, pain, and loss. And his teachings offer us a release from our own ego-driven, fearful, striving way of being. His teachings open us to a life of compassion, gratitude, and acceptance, so that we can respond to life's ever-changing events with trust and hope and gratitude. It is through Jodo Shinshu Buddhism that we find safety and serenity. When we find it when we entrust ourselves to the wisdom and compassion of the Amida Buddha, the Buddha of eternal life and infinite light. Through the primary vow of the Amida Buddha, our hearts and minds are transformed. When we open our hearts to deep entrusting, when we truly, in the depths of our being, embrace the unconditional compassion contained in that vow, that is when we are transformed. That is when peace begins. That is when we dwell in safe harbor, no matter what happens in this world. And so, in a world that is constantly shifting and changing, when times are frightening and painful, we live with entrusting hearts, and we live with gratitude, free and alive to everything that happens. It is living with gratitude and compassion that actually makes a difference in this world. Living with gratitude and compassion actually does shift and change our world. As Dr. Jeff Wilson, who's a Shin Buddhist and professor of religious studies and East Asian studies, says in a book I just love, Buddhism of the Heart, he says, by taking that offered refuge, we commit ourselves to finding a better way than that provided by the usual way of greed, competition, hostility, bias, dualism, and delusion. And even though we fall short of the goal, entrusting is the most profound work of the Shin Buddhist, the arising of Shinjin, which sees the foolish limitations of the ego and surrenders them to the nurturance of the all-embracing other power. Wrapped, each one of us, in the compassion of the Amida Buddha, we send our own love and compassion to and for those who are grieving and feeling lost these days. We grieve especially for those who have lost so much in the Maui wildfires, and we wrap our hearts around them. And together we say, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu.